I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a group of concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. Well, it's been a while since we recorded a podcast, and I don't have to tell anyone that there's been a lot that's happened in the last few months. And while it might be tempting to focus on the new U.S. administration and its efforts to undermine climate action, we're more solution-focused here. And so instead, we want to focus on a topic that is actually regulated much more at a state and local level, where there are huge opportunities to make progress, really regardless of who sits in the White House.
Absolutely. The lack of availability of affordable housing is a growing problem in many parts of the world. And on top of that, global population is continuing to grow. No matter how we slice it, we're going to have to build a lot more living space over the next decade. At the same time, we need to be rapidly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to keep global climate targets within reach. In some ways, the need to build and cut out emissions are at odds with one another. However, if we're thoughtful about how and where we build, we have the opportunity to create more livable communities while also significantly limiting the emissions that we generate. Though it does sound too good to be true, our guest today has done a lot of thinking about the topic and makes some compelling arguments for why it's possible. But before we jump into the world of buildings, let's talk about this week's reason for hope.
Thanks, Flora. While the US is again stepping back when it comes to climate change and withdrawing from the Paris Agreement yet again, the exact opposite is happening on the other side of the world. So it looks like this year, China's CO2 emissions might actually peak. And that's even with an increase of 6 to 7% in the electricity consumption. Last year, China installed 64% of the wind energy installations that happened globally, compared to only 5% in the US. And if you think that's crazy, that was about 75 gigawatts of wind energy they installed. They installed 277 gigawatts of solar in the same time period, so about 3.7 times as much. I guess my point is here that China's set the example of where we need to go. We need to just button down while we've got this new administration in. We need to still focus and still realize that the climate's not going to stop, for 4 years and wait for us. We need to continue to catch up.
Yeah, I think the progress that's been made in China continues to be made is a great example. I mean, we've talked about it before. Obviously, it's more in the forefront given now that, they've sort of positioning themselves as kind of, climate leader as the US is sort of stepping back from things like Paris. And I think it is a good reminder that, progress is still continuing to be made. This is a global issue. And, US emissions may not fall as quickly as they otherwise would have in the next 4 years. But as we'll get to too, there's opportunities to make progress at a state and local level, regardless of what the federal government is doing. So yeah, super excited to see China really leaning in on climate. Well, with that, let's get to today's topic. Our guest today on the podcast is renowned architect and thought leader, Vishaan Chakrabarti. Vishaan is the founder of POW, the Practice for Architectural and Urbanism in New York City. He's served as the Manhattan Planning Director, taught at Columbia University, and served as the Dean of College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. Vishaan is also author of several books, including A Country of Cities, A Manifesto for Urban America, as well as The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature, Culture, and Joy, that was just released this past fall. And excited to have him back on the podcast. Vishaan, welcome again to Climate Optimists. Good to have you back.
Thanks. Great to be back.
So, as we do this show, it's all about starting kind of with a moment of kind of hope and wondering, what have you seen in the last year plus that gives you hope when it comes to addressing climate change?
What gives me hope is I think there is now a kind of growing school of thought around this idea of abundance. If you listen to Ezra Klein, if you think about some of the local things that I'm seeing in our politics about grassroots movements, about building more urban housing, building infrastructure, we fail as much as we succeed. If you follow the congestion pricing war in New York City. So It's not that we're through the problems, but I think there is a growing sentiment that we need to build, and we need to build in ways that are smart in terms of the climate. And that, like, a lot of the scarcity and precarity issues that have been out there in society in terms of people not being able to afford housing, not, having long commutes to work and so forth, that we're starting to coalesce around a set of ideas that will lead to policy solutions, lead to design solutions that are really important if we're going to address climate change, but also if we're going to address people's daily needs. So it's not like you either address your daily needs or you address climate change, but actually you can do both at the same time. That can help.
Well, that's a hopeful thought in and of itself, right? That there are these
Yeah,
co-benefits, right? The solutions aren't
right.
aren't different. Well, let's start off maybe with some basics for folks who may not be as familiar with buildings. Start with kind of like how are buildings, how do they generate emissions sort of directly and indirectly?
Yeah, I mean, to just the quickest answer is there's their embodied energy, what it took to produce the materials and the energy it took to construct the building, right? And so that's like kind of the embodied carbon. And then there's the operational emissions, which is what, the emissions that come from its daily use, the heating, the air conditioning, that the building's inhabitants need. And both are big problems, right? Like, depending on who you read, buildings account for about 40% of global carbon emissions. At the same time, we live in a planet of 8 billion people. A lot of people are unhoused or underhoused. We're projected to go to a planet of about 10 billion people by the end of this century. And that includes the fact that there's declining population rates in a lot of our industrialized nations, right? So we're going to have 2 billion more people, even given that fact. And so we're going to need to build. So we have to figure out smarter ways to build, denser ways to build, more ecologically friendly ways to build.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in essence, it becomes being thoughtful about your material choices, being thoughtful about how you heat and cool the buildings, et cetera, how efficient they are. Well,
I
maybe
should just say there's massive, massive effort going on that front. Concrete, which is one of the worst carbon materials in terms of just what it takes to produce it. I'm on the board of a bioconcrete company where we're trying to make concrete with algae. There's all sorts of different efforts going on all around the world to make more carbon efficient building materials.
so. Given all that, how are building emissions at a macro level trending? Are we still going up? Are we going down?
No, they're going up right now because right now there's all sorts of hurly-burly building going on. I mean, slowed down a bit with inflation, slowed down a bit with the pandemic, but we have a housing shortage globally. And so there's a lot of building going on that's not very carbon efficient. There's still a lot of sprawl being built. And so that also is like a really interesting question. Like a single family house has a lot less embodied energy than an apartment building that's maybe near a subway line. That does not make the single family house better for the environment. And so you have to it's a much more complex dynamic equation than looking statically at just what the carbon is associated with buildings.
So let's talk about that a little bit, Vishaan. What's sort of behind this kind of sprawl and build out of single family homes that we often see as kind of the solution to the housing issues we're facing?
We massively incentivized it through government policy after World War II. So,
Okay.
people associate single family homes with the American dream. The American dream, when it was like first conceived and kind of written down in the 1930s, had nothing to do with cars or houses. It had to do with this idea of equal opportunity for everyone in the country. What happened with suburbanization is we had built up a war machine during World War II that we basically recalibrated into building homes, cars, highways. We passed the Federal Highway Act in 1956, the mortgage interest deduction, which for years really only applied to home ownership because condos are a relatively new thing. The GI Bill, like just legislative act after legislative act that incentivized suburbs, and then also an extraordinary amount of racial segregation that was sought after in terms of redlining, placing better school budgets into white suburban districts. And so this was a huge act of design, right? But I think you are seeing a younger generation look for difference than single family homes. And so we're seeing this actually in the American West, in the American, well, certainly across Texas. You see all this multifamily housing being built in Austin and San Antonio. You see it in Nashville. You see it in Kansas City. And apartment living is no longer kind of this phenomena of the coast, right? There's still a lot of sprawl being built in certain cities. I just finished my sixth cross country drive, and I love driving cross country. It's a beautiful country. And the thing is, if you love the nature of the country, then you want to avoid building sprawl, because what ruins the landscape is suddenly like all of these houses. It's also what is going to trigger more forest fire danger. And then stuff like, it's amazing to me when I read about like, oh, there are all these bears like invading our suburban subdivision. No, no, no. The subdivision invaded the bear, right? And they're just trying to cope, right? And so we keep building where we shouldn't be building. And I think we're probably going to see tax incentives and things now shift towards multifamily housing in response to climate concerns and driving. We're going to see insurance back away from insuring single family homes in fire prone areas and flood prone areas. And so this thing of 1950s, 1960s suburbanization, I think is going to go into a new phase where people are voting with their feet and with their wallet and saying, maybe we need to rethink this.
Well, I mean, that's good to hear. And I guess, we're talking about denser living. I mean, if you were to kind of describe or remind people what the kind of concept of this is, what are the other elements that are present? So hearing apartment complexes, row houses, things like that. What other things kind of characterize this denser living that we're talking about?
Well, to me, what's critical about it is to not think of housing as widgets. It's about building neighborhoods, right?
Okay.
So it's not just the housing, but like, where do people get their groceries? Where do they send their kid to school? Where do they get healthcare? How do they see their elderly parent? All of that needs to be thought about as a network, not as an imposition, right? But what we're seeing data-wise is places that have complete neighborhoods are the places that are gentrifying in the country. And so that points to both a problem, it points to both a good thing and a bad thing. It points to a bad thing in that we don't have enough of those places, so there's a lot of demand for them, and so their prices have gone up. But it also points to a good thing, which is people want to live that way. It isn't some imposition from on high. People, once they start experiencing that, they're like, oh, this is pretty great. Like, this is like a nice way to live. And, that doesn't mean that they can't go camping on the weekend and go live in nature. In fact, that campground is going to be closer if it's not invaded by sprawl, where you have to chop through all the suburban traffic to get to that campground. And so it's really, really important that we don't just start building apartment buildings in the middle of nowhere, right? That's not going to help the situation, because those people then are going to need cars and they're going to need parking garages, and that makes the apartments really expensive. And it doesn't really address that much of the problem.
Some people might be hearing this and thinking, city, they've been someplace that has kind of that walkable neighborhood. But, it sounds like this approach could be scaled. I'm wondering to what degree it could be scaled to, let's say, more like big towns or even, rural areas, right?
Yep.
I'm guessing it isn't exclusive to this idea of a huge city.
No, and in fact, my book goes to great length to talk about the fact that the kind of conditions that we want to see in terms of community building can exist at all scales. And in fact, big cities often fail. Big cities are often segregated, and they often, live off of legacy transit systems that are now failing, and they can't fund them. So there's a lot of small community. I mean, we have a built project in Columbus, Indiana, a town of 55,000 people in the middle of Indiana, actually quite a diverse place, beautiful downtown, where they are trying to create a more walkable, more vibrant downtown. So there are examples across the country of fairly small places And even in rural areas, one of the interesting thing about rural areas is America did something very, very different thanks to Thomas Jefferson and this idea of manifest destiny. I mean, you asked earlier on, like, where does suburbanization come from? The seed of it comes from Jefferson's 1 mile grid, where he plots a 1 mile grid over the entire nation. And it's this whole idea of homesteading, where a farmer and their family live on a huge plot of land that is their farm. Historically, if you look around the world, if you look at the farming village that my family comes from in India, the farming village that my wife's family comes from in Greece, farmers all lived together. And then they went out, did their work, and then came back home into a community. So even then, they lived in a kind of urban condition. We created somewhat artificially this idea that people are supposed to live in this segregated fashion. And it's led to a lot of the problems that we have in our country: loneliness epidemic, opioid crisis, this lack of community. I've seen a lot of small towns in rural America that had downtowns and main streets. And then the malls came along and decimated the downtowns. And so then everyone was hanging out in the malls. But then there was another phase where big box stores and online commerce came and decimated the malls. So now
Okay.
you don't even have the public space in the malls anymore. You just have big box stores sitting in a sea of asphalt, and you have people in their glowing screens in their basements, right? And like there's no place for the community to be. Where are teens hanging out? We've made it harder for people to interact in physical space, right? And so they turn to online stuff. Social media has a vested interest in dividing us, in being inflammatory, in amplifying rage, right? But when we're face to face, we have to take on a different behavior pattern. And it means that people are inherently more communal. I was in rural Utah where my RV had a problem, and I went to an RV service center, and I was talking to the guy at the counter, and he said, my grandparents never talked about whom they voted for, and I don't either, right? Like, it wasn't this thing where you had to shove your political view in someone's face, because you lived in community and you had to get along the day after the election. And so that's why what I'm talking about applies equally to rural areas as it does to big cities.
So, you talking about this community in Indiana, I guess I'm wondering, in your travels, are there other places that have kind of done this well, big or small? And, what are the characteristics? I'm hearing, like, a walkable downtown area, maybe green space. I mean, what do these places look like in practice?
So there's this place, Patchogue, Long Island, in the middle of suburban Long Island, where the mayor of Patchogue, probably over a decade ago, decided, the Long Island Railroad runs right through the town, and there are a lot of empty parking lots. There's a lot of issues with drugs and crime, and basically actively densified the downtown, right? Created multifamily housing. There are all these restaurants. The train station area went from feeling kind of barren and dangerous to a place that was much more vibrant. So how does all this relate to climate? Those folks are now walking around instead of using their cars. They're living in apartments instead of living in single family homes. One of the most interesting things about this density issue is, like, take a supermarket, a local supermarket. You need a fair amount of density to support a local supermarket. One of the things I've noticed downtown is, or excuse me, as I travel across the country, is that with the downtowns dying, as I said before, like in some places, I found that the only place to get groceries was like the local gas station. This is this issue about density that we really need to think through. That again, I've seen examples, rural America, suburban America, where people can make a difference, and it's not about building Manhattan or Hong Kong. It's just about rebuilding Main Street, really.
Well, and I'm wondering, kind of given that, people who might live in a suburb and are thinking about this and saying, well, am I in the wrong place? I'm guessing that you can create these as well within your suburbs, right? That creating downtown areas
Well,
that,
Patchogue was a suburb. I mean, in some ways it still is. But yeah, look, there are plenty of examples of rail-based suburbs. Oak Park, Illinois, Maplewood, New Jersey, where you have main streets. They're usually tied somehow to that rail station, right? What's a lot harder is when it's an exurb as opposed to a suburb, right? Where, you're 40 miles from Phoenix, from downtown Phoenix. The only way to get around is to drive. The only economy are sort of the big box stores and office parks that are now largely empty, And so the thing about those places is they're very fragile. They're very economically fragile. They're very ecologically fragile, right? They're built on the cheap. We've got a situation in Phoenix where it's getting so hot that people are like tripping on the sidewalk and having to be hospitalized for burns, not from the fall, but from how hot the pavement is. Because we built so much sprawl in the desert that the heat island effect is so immense. We are now in real time seeing the impacts of climate in places like that, climate change in places like that. And it's hard to imagine that some of these places that we built, which are fairly recently built in the last few decades, are sustainable. That's a hard suburb to retrofit, is my point. Whereas
Right.
I think the suburbs that are closer in, you can retrofit, and especially the ones that are somehow attached to a regional rail system.
So we're talking about this, and it's making me think about, obviously public transit, which has all sorts of climate benefits. What needs to be done? Is it kind of like you build first, and then the public transit goes in, you build the two in concert with one another? How do those things scale up?
Yeah, it's a case by case basis. I mean, in the case of Patchogue, the train was there. What tends to happen is when mayors and communities decide that they're going to densify, the train schedules will get better, right? The more people, the more they can justify better train service. That will attract more people, and that turns into a virtuous cycle. If there is no transit, then I think what you really have to look to in terms of densification is dedicating a certain amount of lanes in the streets to bus rapid transit. So first of all, you need an enough density, like at least like 30 units an acre, which is, kind of small apartment scale density. But the thing is, in a lot of America, quite frankly, buses are seen as something that poor brown people and black people take,
Right.
right? There's a huge class and racial divide around mass transit. The former mayor of Bogota, I'm going to paraphrase, but basically had this great statement. He said, a developed country isn't a place where poor people have cars. It's a place where rich people use mass transit,
That's
right?
great.
And yeah. And so, and part of what that flows from isn't because somehow people become angels and start using mass transit. It's that in New York and San Francisco and, like I can point to cities in South America where they've made car use onerous enough that it is faster, more efficient, and a better experience to take mass transit because you are never going to get people of wealth and privilege to take mass transit unless driving their car is made painful.
Right.
Right. And the way it's made painful is just there's this thing called the Transmilenio, very famous in Bogota, where you just dedicate huge strips of traffic lanes to fast moving buses. Because people think of bus and they think it moves slowly. It only moves slowly because it's trying to navigate, single occupant vehicle traffic. If it's in its own bus lane, it can move as fast as a subway. But that means that there's fewer lanes for the cars. The cars are going to experience more congestion, more traffic. Politicians are going to get complaints, but that's how you get people out of their cars and into the bus. But the other thing I just want to say about that is I know that sounds very kind of draconian, but you also have to think about who the younger generation is. A lot of them don't have driver's licenses, and a lot of them are very, very dedicated to the idea of using their phones at all time. And so driving is not that appealing an idea for them. This notion that they have to be undistracted driving a car, right? And while people will say, well, the solution to that is autonomous vehicles, that's a disastrous solution. Because then you have everyone in their bubbles on their phone, right? But the car still takes up the same amount of space. To me, this is all doable within the fabric of the United States. It's all affordable. And it's something that, again, you can do to give people choices. You're not saying you've got to do X or you've got to do Y, but to give people choices and also to balance the scales between some of the subsidies and other policy things that were done after World War II. To say, maybe we're going to stop subsidizing single family homes. Maybe we're going to stop doing so many free highways and instead put the money in multifamily homes and mass transit. And that will make a massive difference in terms of the climate, especially because what we're talking about at some level, Jason, is kind of redefining the idea of what the American dream is, not around a car and a house, but more around opportunity and freedom. If you do that, it will have a huge global impact. Because today, something I know from my travels is that the old version of the American dream, the subway, or the single family house, the car, has metastasized all over the planet. So you have billions of people who now think that when I'm successful, I'm going to have a car and two houses. And if you have billions of people living that way, the planet's just screwed. The amount of land degradation, like it's incredibly challenging to imagine a planet living that way. So this shift in what the American dream is, this shift in what the definition of success is, that can have a really widespread global impact in my mind.
Well, I guess people are listening thinking, sounds great. I guess what, you're talking about changes in zoning, changes in incentives. What can people do to help advocate for the changes?
I think it's the most critical aspect of it, which is to work locally with local elected officials, community boards, to say, yes, we want this in our communities. Right now, communities largely have a reputation of saying no to everything, of being not in my backyard and so forth. And unfortunately, a lot of that's true of older white progressive communities. But we're seeing a younger generation who, again, is on this abundance agenda. Like there's this great nonprofit in New York City called Open New York that's advocating for just much more housing in New York City. That can happen at the local level where young people can use sort of grassroots energy, run for office or, advocate in front of your city council. The thing is, I think a lot of politicians today, especially Democratic politicians, understand that they need to build more multifamily housing, understand that they need to build more, mass transit, bus rapid transit, things like that. But they need political cover, right?
Right.
Because all they hear from their communities is no, 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 we don't want anything to change. And what that means is that all the young people in those communities are going to continue to be priced out of the lives that their parents and their grandparents had. And so the climate argument is woven through all of it, but it's not going back to where we started, it's not necessarily the central thrust of the argument. It's implicit, right? Because it's the more joyful, affordable, communal way to live, right? And oh, by the way, it'll also help save the planet.
Well, I like the vision you paint for a potential future that's not only more affordable, but creates more community and, of course, helps us with addressing the climate and environmental crises we're facing. And to your point, we can help realize that vision by really just getting involved locally and advocating for these, core changes. Well, Vishaan, thanks for joining us again, sharing your knowledge, and for all you do in helping create a more sustainable planet.
Great. Thanks very much, Jason. Great to see you.
Well, I really enjoyed talking again with Vishaan. I appreciate his optimism, and I really like the fact that, what we're wanting to do here from a climate perspective, it also helps us create these more livable communities that everybody wants to be in. And I think it's important to kind of quickly highlight the true opportunity that we're talking about here. If you take buildings that are roughly 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions and passenger transport, which is about 7%, you put those two together, and as Vishaan pointed out, they're very linked. You're talking roughly 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, this idea of building more livable, denser communities has huge potential to help us deal with climate change. I don't know, Flora, what were your takeaways?
Well, I think that's a great point. And I feel like when I listened to the interview, there were a ton of takeaways, but I think the most applicable thought that I immediately had was when Vishaan had spoken to rising insurance in flooding and wildfire areas, and the fact that that could potentially help reduce urban sprawl or maybe even usher in the end of urban sprawl. I could not help but think of the fires in LA, which have been catastrophic and relentless.
Right.
And generally, this urban sprawl is an issue in much of America. According to CBS News, a third of all American homes exist in the wildland-urban interface. And in LA, since the 1930s, there's been free ability and even governmental incentive to build on LA's fire belt, where not only fires, but also
Mhm.
wind that in the last week reached up to 80 miles per hour are routine. So for me, LA is an impressive example of urban sprawl. Even in zoning code, you can find the threat. Almost 80% of the city's area is zoned exclusively for single family homes, which has economically encouraged development to spread outward rather than upwards. And now we're seeing
Right.
single family homes built densely along the fire belt that are going up in flame. It's a devastating event, and I in no way mean to make light of that. It really does present a moment to think critically about the ways in which we're going to build our communities as we move forward.
Yeah, I think you're right, Flora. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, LA's events have been tragic,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it'd be even more tragic if we don't learn from them, right? And starting to deal with sprawl is something we need to be tackling, and obviously in conjunction with that, as we're building our communities, building them to be more climate resilient as well as more efficient. There's opportunity there, and the potential for fire in the American West is only going to grow as time goes on. So we need to be looking at these things now.
Yeah, definitely. That was, I mean, another thing that I was thinking of while I listened was, he had mentioned bioconcrete made from algae, which then had me interested in other examples of carbon efficient building materials, which are obviously going to be huge in the future as we move forward with rebuilding more resilient communities. I found this 2024 study that compares embodied carbon emissions of residential housing made with traditional building materials and low carbon materials. And it found that using low carbon materials can significantly reduce CO2. And I think Thomas can talk probably a little bit more than I can to some of the advancements in, low carbon materials. But the biggest innovations that I found when I was looking into these carbon efficient building materials often serve to replace concrete, which is responsible for approximately 8% of global CO2 emissions. I came across cross laminated timber, which is load bearing, cost competitive with concrete, and sequesters carbon. I read about hempcrete, which claims to be even better than other net zero options because of hemp's impressively fast natural carbon absorption. And I also read about biochar, which I know we've spoken to before in the podcast, which is charcoal made from organic waste and can be used in concrete to replace more carbon intensive ingredients. In fact, studies have found that biochar production has the potential to reduce CO2 emissions by 3.7 gigatons per year. So, definitely plenty of advancements as far as materials go.
Yeah, the thing that really hit me was the interaction between the transport and the building and the way the layout of the buildings is done. So it's one thing to go and make a low carbon building, but as he pointed out, if you go and put that in some isolated community somewhere with no services around it, people are still highly dependent upon transport. And typically in the
Mm-hmm.
US and Australia, that's personal transport. In fact, I went back and looked at some data from Portland, where, of course, I used to live, and there 84% of trips are made using a car, right? Compared to only about 3% of trips made by bicycle. And that's good by American standards, which is
Right.
mind
Yep.
boggling. But then when we go and look at what Paris is doing, for example, they've massively increased their ridership rate in the last few years with this whole greening the city plan. And their bicycle riding rates are now double that of the number of trips made by car, which is just mind boggling. And you think that's good. Then you go to Amsterdam, and more than 40% of trips there are made by bicycle. Basically, very few trips are made by private car in a city like Amsterdam. So there is great opportunity not only to make the building materials low emissions, but if we lay out our cities right and we have good mixed use utilization and great transportation options, there is an opportunity to massively reduce the transportation emissions associated with those buildings.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Thomas. I mean, the truth is, it really, as Vishaan points out, it's not about just building green. It's about, thinking through the whole community design as you're doing it. And, we talk about increasing bicycling infrastructure. I think it's worth mentioning another one of the sort of critical reforms that needs to take place, and that's eliminating parking minimums, which are still
Mm-hmm.
a thing in many places in the US. And
Yeah.
you have benefits of reduced building costs, heat island effect. You encourage things like cycling and increased walkability. And London, of course, did this over 20 years ago, got rid of their parking minimums. Mexico City did it back in like 2017, and now US cities are really starting to follow. In terms of the buildings themselves, I think another key tool in the tool bag in terms of creating greener communities is putting in place what are called building emission performance standards. They really target, the energy and emissions per square foot or per square meter, almost like a fuel economy standard. And they say, basically a building has to meet a certain standard by a certain date. Building performance standards are, starting to gain traction here in the US. You've got places like Tokyo who had one in place a long time ago, but now in the US, Boston, New York have them, and you have other, major cities following suit. Europe, you've got a lot of they call building energy standards that are focused more not just on like the carbon, but the energy use of the building, which, indirectly deals with carbon. But yeah, I mean, all of these things, as I mentioned kind of at the top of the episode, are things that are in control of local municipalities, right? At a city level, you can put in place a building performance standard. You can get rid of your parking minimums. You can invest more in cycling infrastructure. And so to me, that is like a really optimistic message, especially in light of what's going on here in the US at a federal level, is like those things are out of sight for the feds, right? This is about
Yeah.
making change at a local level and replicating it, city after city after city.
Yeah. And I think along those lines too, it is very important that we remember there is a lot of embodied energy that goes into a building. And
Mm-hmm.
often to extend the life of that building so you can amortize the CO2 emissions over a longer period of time, all you've got to do is put that little bit of extra effort in to make that building more flexible in its use patterns in the future, more resilient to climate and weather extremes and other factors, and basically make it last longer. If you can make that building last longer, it is in its impact typically less than a short-lived building that ends up getting destroyed in 40 years and rebuilt again.
Yeah, you're totally right there. I mean, I think of the saying in the building industry you hear a lot, which is the greenest building is the building you don't have to build, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so we've got tons of great buildings out there that would benefit from retrofits, right? And to your point, Thomas, as we're building new structures, let's build them more robustly. It makes a ton of sense, even if it's a few more dollars and cents upfront. If you look at the long term kind of return on investment, it's substantial.
Well, with that, let's turn to today's calls to action. Our option one is to advocate for changes where you live. As a US citizen right now, I feel like it's really, really easy to feel helpless, especially when it comes to climate. And this is a sector where not only is there a lot of good to be done, but it's also something that's addressed at the state and local level. So I really do feel like this is, a huge area for opportunity. And we encourage you to take the time this week to ask your city, or at least inquire online, does your city still have parking minimums? If so, tell them that it's time to get rid of them. Does your city have a building performance standard? And if not, call on them to adopt one.
As a second option, maybe think about how you can go about using a transportation option other than your car that you're using today. So that might just be jumping back on that bike that you've got sitting in the back of the garage. Or alternatively, if you're not quite in the same shape you were 20 years ago, maybe invest in an electric bicycle. They're such a great solution. for doing those daily chores that you would otherwise do by car. Get a set of panniers on the back of it. You can load it up with groceries. You can do all those trips, and all of a sudden, you're not sitting in traffic. It becomes so much more fun, and you're getting ripped at the same time.
Well, Thomas, I can't help but feel like maybe you were talking to me a little bit there. Reliance on my electric car. But yes, very good call to action. Well, that's it for today's episode. As a reminder, we're working to really reinvest our energy in local events. And given that, our podcast schedule will remain kind of periodic and in flux for the time being. Or if you want to stay plugged in the meantime, don't forget to follow us on social, or head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and sign up for our newsletter. Climate Optimist is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective.